Today, we're going to talk about a big project that I just completed that I have been working on for almost 5 months. Okay. I have just finished my first knitted sweater. Okay. This is like a huge thing for me. I've never knit a sweater before, I've never crocheted a sweater before. But this past September, my husband and I had celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary. I had promised him that I would make him a sweater last year, but that attempt had ultimately crashed and burned. Okay, it was a total failure. Um, a lot of things went wrong on that first attempt. Not that things didn't go wrong with this attempt, but a lot of things went wrong on that attempt. For example, I had made the completely wrong yarn choice for my first wearable. Um, I'm going to tell you what I chose, but just know that I'm really embarrassed to actually admit it. And thinking back on this choice now, I just know that I was insane for actually trying to knit my first sweater with this yarn. But the choice that I had made was blanket yarn. Yep, I chose blanket yarn.
Really?
Which, like many people, I absolutely despise to work with. And I do have blankets made out of blanket yarn, but only because I bought a ton of it a few years ago when we were all obsessed with it. And then I had it in my house, so I just made something with it. And while I absolutely hate blanket yarn, the love of my life absolutely adores the things that I make out of it. He is all about our handmade crochet blankets made with that Bernat blanket yarn. He just loves it. And while I do also love the blankets themselves, making them wasn't enjoyable enough for me to ever buy this yarn again with the intention of doing it one more time. In fact, every time I use blanket yarn, I remember just how much I hate it. It feels awful moving through your fingers. It's so bulky. You have to move your wrists like crazy, and the stitch definition is awful, and it can be so difficult to differentiate your stitches. And also, it's just like holy friction, it's so rough on your skin. But anyway, my husband didn't know that side of things. All he knew was that I really liked snuggling under these blankets too, so he naturally thought that blanket yarn is just awesome and asked me to make him a hoodie out of it. Now, I do see where he was going with this. Yeah, I was picking up on what he was putting down, but I completely forgot how much working with this yarn totally sucks. And I also overestimated my skill level by thinking that I could just buy a totally different yarn than the pattern I chose called for, and I would have no difficulty adapting the pattern to such a wildly bigger gauge size. Yeah, that was foolish, and sometimes I genuinely wonder like who I think I am. But the stage had been set for disappointment, and had I done the responsible thing, I would have gently told my husband that blanket yarn probably wasn't the best choice, considering all the details, i.e., its properties and my skill level. In hindsight, it probably could have been fun to like yarn shop with him or to like teach him about different type of yarn materials to see if he had a preference, but instead I just did what I always do, which is blindly accept a challenge under the wildly misplaced solution that I can indeed do anything. Spoiler alert. I could not knit a sweater with blanket yarn. Instead, I knitted a couple rows like the pattern I called for, immediately realized my error, and silently accepted that this project was about to die near meters in front of the starting line. So now this yarn sits in random places around my house and stands as a gentle reminder that I am, in fact, only human. I tried, I failed, but as months passed, the guilt of promising my husband something nice and then quickly bailing entirely on that promise made me realize that I was about to take on learning to knit a sweater until there was one sitting completed to his specific measurements right in front of me. This time, I bought some nice yarn, and at some point I realized that this yarn choice was probably an overcompensation for my initial failure, but still, she's fancy. Her name is Malabrigo Rios, Cielo and Tierra, and she's gorgeous, but the girl ain't cheap, and she is quite expensive, unfortunately, depending on where you bought it. I wish I had researched a couple more places where I could have could have bought this, but wasn't the cheapest yarn, but still, she is pretty. My husband is 6'6", and he looks like he could carry me out of a burning building, so you get the idea. And I knew I was going to need a lot of yarn for this project. So ultimately, I think I ended up using like 12 skeins. Oh man, there were multiple games of yarn chicken that were played that I lost both times. Um, each time there was an impromptu visit to a local knitting shop. To pick up some additional skeins before I ran out completely. But the thing about Malabrigo yarns is that they're kettle dyed in small batches, and dye lots can vary greatly, like really, really greatly. The same color can seem like it is very much not the same color. And Malabrigo openly admits this on their website, and they even say that skeins from the same dye lot can look, quote, extremely different from one another. That's from the same dye lot, okay? Now, I get it, like the same recipe is being used every time they kettle dye, but that doesn't mean that the way that recipe ultimately fans out on the wool itself is going to be uniform, and I mean it definitely won't be, but sometimes it can be extremely not uniform. Like the website literally says that the differences between skeins can be extremely noticeable. That's what they say. And they recommend working from two different balls of yarn at once, in order to optimize color randomization. So, do a couple rows, alternate, do a couple rows, alternate. And like, that's nice, but I can't do that. And if there are people out there in the world who go this hard, that's wonderful. All the more power to you. But this girl don't go that hard. I can't be bothered. So they keep trying to make alternating skeins happen. It's not going to happen for me, but teach their own. So I chose the pattern Tavish by Martin Story, and it's graded intermediate, and I'll stand by that. It does indeed feel quite intermediate. I'm going to be completely honest. I had frogged and restarted various pieces of this pattern like multiple times. So many times, like I'm embarrassed to even talk about it. My goodness. The back panel, for example, got frogged at least 3 times. And I know that at least 2 of those times were because I forgot to cast the ribbing onto smaller needles than those that I used for stockinette. And honestly, trudging through new patterns and differentiating between various phrasing of the same instruction techniques can be really exhausting. I totally get that, like, I mean, I can't even imagine making a pattern at this point. But for the people who do, like, more power to you. People who have like ADHD and get hung up on words, and people who don't, but just people who are easily distracted when there are so many words on that page. Like I wish we could get patterns to look like Apple stores. Just like very, very straightforward. But yeah, I found myself reading these things over and over again just in an attempt to catch my mistake before I made it. Unfortunately, for me and most people, growth grows strongest where the deepest mistakes are made, and the most effective way to learn is by doing. So I made those mistakes, baby. For example, one of the other times that I frogged back was because I missed the phrase at each end, like quote, like in the patterns where they're like decrease 1 time at each end or whatever. Well, I missed that phrase, where the pattern was outlining its decreases. So I was only decreasing once on each row, at one end and not at each. And I was alternating the decrease side every other row. And my God, that mistake was costly. I also read the pattern wrong again while doing the sleeves, and I increased every third and seventh row instead of every fourth, which led my sleeves to have way too many increases, and now they are quite large. I didn't initially tell my husband this until he put it on, and the sleeves were kind of big. But yeah, I started this project in June and I finished it on Sunday, October 20th, kind of. There were a couple things that I did after. But for the most part, it was finished on the blocking boards on Sunday, October 20th. So I spent nearly 5 months working and learning on this bad boy. And before I was even halfway through, honestly, I began to tire of this elephant that I had promised both me and my husband that I would eat. But like my friend likes to remind me, elephants are eaten one bite at a time. So I kept going even when I really didn't want to, and even when stockinette got boring, and even when I'd realized that I had messed up and I would need to completely redo a piece of the sweater that I had already grown tired of making. There were more than enough days where I had to beg myself not to abandon this project for one that looked newer and shinier and more exciting. And after not being able to withstand the intensity that comes with dedicating all of your free time to one project, I decided to start a palette cleanser project on the side about 2 weeks ago. It's a colorful and mind-numbing rippled baby blanket, and sometimes you just need to get away from the project that is currently making you think too much. You know what I mean? There's nothing wrong with having a few stitches on the side. Anyway, knitting a project made with so many separate pieces meant to be assembled together was also quite a new experience for me. My previous completed knit projects have been mostly hats and socks were so much fun to knit. Once I figured out how to make them, I basically spent the entire winter of 2021 knitting socks. But socks aren't in the round, and so are a lot of hats, and making a sweater requires, not always, but it can require multiple pieces knitted separately and then, sewed together. But sewing happened to be an entirely different wall to climb that I have very little prior experience with, but I didn't even know this when I was still just executing pieces. And I say 6 pieces and not four. I made 6 pieces, not four. Because I didn't just knit a regular old sweater, people. I knit a hoodie. And this baby comes not only with a hood, a freaking drawstring for that hood, and a pocket. Okay? This hoodie literally comes fully loaded, but when you want to be fully loaded, you need to work hard to get there. So 6 pieces, baby. Actually, no. Actually, no. This is 7 pieces. 2 panels, 2 sleeves. It's 4. Hood, 5. Pocket, 6. Drawstring, 7. Crap! This thing is 7 pieces. Okay? So yeah, 7 pieces. Some of which were frogged more than once and some more than twice. And I know of at least one piece I frogged 3 times. Jesus, man, this project really made me lean into that learning curve. And while most of the time I very much wished that I was skilled enough in knitting that the pattern was easier for me to consistently understand and execute correctly, I did recognize that the only way I would ever get to that level would be by finishing the sweater and then another and then another. By the 80th sweater, man, I'm going to be a real pro. I say that because I used to have this awesome professor in nursing school. Her name was Professor Stanley. And oh my gosh, she was working late into her 70s. But whenever we doubted our ability to be real nurses in the real world, after school, she would say, "Oh, by the 80th time, you'll be able to do it in your sleep." She'd always just say, by the 80th time, literally all the time. And she would wave her hand at us dismissively, kind of like she was shooing our worries away. And she died not long after I had graduated, but I do think about her a lot. She was just such an amazing nurse, such an awesome teacher, a really wonderful woman. And now I can say 1 sweater down and 79 more to go. So I knit. I knit like crazy. I pinned, I counted, I increased, I decreased, I cast off. I started over, I got bored, I got frustrated, I was proud, and I was motivated. My excitement grew as I watched my piece pile grow, and I knew I had to be able to say that I did it. That I just had to keep going. I needed it to be done. So I did the thing. I didn't do it perfectly, but a completed project is better than no project at all. And while the making and the sewing and the weaving was difficult, blocking was an entire process that I had overlooked and underestimated, and probably where most of my impactful mistakes occurred. So I have wet blocked items before, but not extensively, and I probably should have read up a little bit on how to wet block wearables, especially something like a hoodie. My first mistake was in the very beginning when I chose to wet block such a weighted item in the first place. I now know that I should have chosen to steam block, and I feel really silly that I wet blocked this whole piece. But people generally do what they know, and I classically didn't recognize a gap in my experience or knowledge, and I charged head on into it. Here, watch me make a big mistake. Yep, you see that woman right there? She doesn't know what she's doing, but she doesn't know that she doesn't know what she's doing. That's why this sweater is in danger. Next, I squeezed out a ton of water, like with the entire weight of my non-petite self, and I pinned the hoodie in place. But the ribbing had become quite stretched out just by carrying the weight of the water in the fabric, and when I pinned and dried it, it sealed the stretch out even more. And I only realized the weight of this error when I had asked my husband to try it on. But had I seam blocked it, I would have a better fit because the ribbing wouldn't have stretched out so much. It would have hugged him more around the hips instead of being straight down. It would have been a lot more preventable to make this not happen with steam blocking. The fabric would have been better able to handle that level of water versus what I did, which was immersing it in a bucket of water. And there was a lot of stretching that occurred. And it's that weight of the water that really overstretched the fabric. Immersing it in water was not a good idea. Steam blocking would have been much, much, much better. But again, we live and we learn. The rib doesn't exactly rib, but tucking in shirts is back in style, you know? Oversized, baby. Who said grudge was dead? The 90s are back in town. Um, but yeah, other than that, I mean, the sweater was definitely a learning experience. Of course, I wish the mistakes that I made hadn't been made, but I don't know how to prevent them unless I make them. I don't know how they happen unless they happen. So, you know, learn from your mistakes. I have a finished project. I have something he can definitely wear. Is it the nicest sweater I've ever seen? It's really pretty. Is it the best fitting sweater I've ever seen? Let me rephrase that. It's not the best fitting sweater I've ever seen, but it is warm and it is functional, and I made it for him because I love him. He's lucky because now the next study he get will not be my first, and it's more likely to be even better. So, this whole process was really long. It was a wild ride. If you haven't knit a sweater or crocheted a sweater, you can do it. TL Yarn Crafts has a really good video where she knit her first sweater, and she kind of goes on about how it was really enjoyable to get over that hump of a project in a weird way. Knitting a sweater is kind of like knitting a sweater, crocheting a sweater, whatever you do, it's kind of like the Everest in a way of, knit and crochet. So attempting Everest and maybe not climbing it the best, but still climbing it and succeeding and living to tell the tale, and then having something nice to wear after is a really awesome experience, just to prove to yourself that you are capable and you can do things. And um I highly recommend you give it a go. So good luck to whoever is out there and who wants to knit their own sweater. Take it from me, it's not easy, but it is definitely worth it. Once you do it, you will be a lot more motivated to keep doing it. The first sock I ever knit, it wasn't the best sock I ever knit. But after doing it a couple more times, I got a lot better. And just like Professor Stanley would say, by the 80th time, kids, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. All right, thanks for watching.